In today's episode of PHP Fundamentals, we're going to take a look at loops. So I will open up my sites directory, I'll go into the sandbox that we created, and I'll create a new folder for learning about loops and drag that into my code editor. And this is a very readable way to filter over an array or object. So let's create an array, and we'll use the PHP 5.4 syntax, just keep that in mind. And we will have a list of names. So we'll do my name, we'll do our CEO's name, we'll do my boss's name, and one of my coworkers' names. All right, so now we have this array. If we want to filter over this array, we can use for each. And we're simply saying for each item within this array, how are we going to refer to that item? Well, we will refer to it as name because that's as readable as we can make it. Next, we execute our loop. Now, the way a for each works is the contents of this loop will execute for as many times as items there are in the array, if that makes sense. So in this case, the contents here will execute 4 times because there are 4 items in the array. So in this case, we will simply echo name. I'll save that, and if we view it in the browser, we of course get this syntax error because, again, when we're using MAMP, it does not have support for PHP 5.4. So if you did want to use this, you'd of course have to compile PHP 5.4 from scratch. Then you would go into your applications, MAMP, htdocs folder, into the sandbox, into loops, and then we would run php index.php, and we get that list. Because of course, with my command line version of PHP, that is 5.4.3. But in this case, I'm not going to assume that you do have that set up, so we'll switch that over to the older syntax. Now, if I come back to Chrome and we view it, there we go, we get the list of names. Good. So really, that's the extent of using for each statements. If you're working with an associative array, so in this case, we'll say array, and maybe we will use titles. So we will say CEO is Collis, and the manager is Tash. Instructor, that would be me, or I'm also a producer. And we will leave it at that. So now we have an associative array. If we filter through it and run this time, now we're going to still get the names, but what if we want to have access to the titles? Well, we could say for each item in the array as the title, name. And that's the only change we have to make. Now we can echo title, reload the page, and there we go. So now, obviously, there's no splits, but we can easily fix that by, of course, wrapping it maybe within a list item. There we go. Now we filtered through all of them. So if we want to give this even a little bit more control, we could wrap this within strong tags, and then we would have the title and then the name. So let's save that, reload the page. Now we have this grouping. So we have looped through the items in the array and displayed it on the page, and that's for each. So let's comment the for each section out. And now I'm going to show you the for, and this is the traditional for statement. If you've ever worked in a C-based language, this should be familiar to you. But if not, that's okay as well. So the way we use a for statement is we create some kind of iterator. So I'll give you an example. So let's create a variable called I, and we'll set that to 0. And this is very common. We're creating an iterator, and we're setting it to 0. So we're saying for the creation of this I variable, and we're setting it to 0, as long as I is less than 10, then I plus equals 1. Now, there's actually 2 ways you can do this. You can write I plus equals 1, or there is a shorthand syntax, which is fairly popular, I plus plus. And that is the same thing as saying increment the value of I by 1. It's assuming that I is a integer, and we're incrementing it exactly by 1. Or you can stick, if you want more readable, which a lot of people think is advantageous, I plus equals 1. So that's saying I plus 1, but we're using equals to say we're resetting that value of I to its current value plus 1. For now, I'm going to stick with I plus plus. So that's our loop. Now I can echo out the value of I. And if we view that in the browser, reload the page, now we are looping through that a total of 10 times. So the difference is with the for each statement, we are looping through all of the items within an array or an object, which you haven't quite learned about. And the for statement is we are specifying exactly how many times to run your loop. But the truth is, you could use a for statement if you wanted to loop through the array. So I'll give you an example. If we want to determine the total number of items within that array, we could say as long as I is less than count array, and that's going to return the total number of items. And I'll prove it to you. We'll comment this out. and we're going to echo count array, reload the page, and there are 3 because there's 3 items within the array. So let's uncomment that. And now we're saying set an iterator to 0. And as long as that current value is less than 3 in our case, then we're going to add 1 to it and run this. So what we're doing here is this test will eventually fail. Think about it. Run through it the first time. Okay, I is 0. Is I less than 3? Yes, it is. All right, so now add 1 to I. So now I is equal to 1, and run this. So we echo out 0. Next, it runs this loop really fast. Now, I is not 0, I is 1. And now we're saying, is 1 less than 3? Yes, it is. Now add 1 to I, and echo that out. And we keep doing that. And what's eventually going to happen is I will be equal to 3. And we'll say, is 3 less than 3? No, it's not. So this never runs, and we continue on. If you want it to run at 3 but not more, you could say if I is less than or equal to, and that will make sure that you get 4 iterations. It just depends on what you need for that specific circumstance. In our case, that's not what we need. And now we can grab that item from the array, and in this case, let's not use the associative, let's use the traditional one. So now we will echo out the array, and we're going to grab I, and that would be equal to array 0 in this case. So let's save that, and if I come back, now we are iterating through that array as we would hope. So this is the same thing as if we had done array 0. Now we're going to get Jeff, Jeff, Jeff. If we do the first item, then we're getting 0, 1. Then we would be echoing Collis. But what's nice about this is if we use the index as a variable, that value will change every single time. So the first loop, it's going to refer to the 0 index in the array. Then it loops again, but now I is equal to a different value. And this is a way we can loop over things and have different results for each loop, as we've done here. Now the last loop we're going to look over is a while statement. There's also a different one called do while, but I don't want to overflow you. We're going to stick with for each, for, and while for the time being. So mostly the while statement is syntactically different. So we could say while I is less than 10, then do this. And now, once again, we will echo a list item with array I, and I need to make sure that I set I to 0 because we shouldn't do that within the while statement. So now I'll reload the page. We're getting the exact same effect. And so this is the thing you need to begin to learn is that in PHP or any programming language, there are lots of different ways to accomplish one task. In this case, we could use a while statement. We could use a for statement. Generally, you will find when looping through arrays, for each is the most readable and the most common, so that's what I would recommend you use, but there are lots of uses. For example, a while statement is excellent when you're fetching rows from a database. You can say while this row is equal to, and then you run a function that will fetch the next row from the database, then proceed. And that will eventually return false because there are no more rows to echo to the screen. Okay, that will do it for this lesson. I want you to take some time and play around with all of these different loops. You have the while loop, the for loop, and the for each loop. Just try to be comfortable with how you would use them in each situation. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask us in the forums. My name is Jeffrey Way, and I will see you in the next lesson.